assess hi here, and I hope others can also just write your name and be able to share where you're from and sort of your interests. All right, I'm Rusas Lina Idrus. I'm one of the board members of Pusat Sejarah Rakyat. We have been organizing this webinar series for the last 13 months. We started as this sort of pandemic induced series that we had to move online, but it actually opened up a lot of different avenues in reaching out to different people. So it's been a really very productive space. For those of you who are interested, we've been exploring different research project related to people's history in Malaysia and exploring different methodologies. You can look at our previous webinars at our website, pusatsejarahyat.org. Little promo there. So please do take a look. So today we're very pleased to have Dr. Lai Takpo. And Jomo just now said, how he's extremely pleased to see that Takpo has continued on with his fieldwork. And I think that's one of the things I've been very impressed with Takpo. I've also known her for decades. I'm very impressed with the perseverance and continuing to do ethnography and the kind of fieldwork that she continues to do. Let me just say a little bit more about Dr. Lai Takpo. She's an environmental and visual anthropologist at University of Science Malaysia and a long-term student of Batek Orang Asli of Pahang, 28 years. Currently, she is working with them on ethnoprimatology and acoustic knowledge, primarily on gibbons. Her most recent publication was Tracking with the Batek Hunter-Gatherers of Malaysia. And she's also the author of the monograph Changing Pathways, Forest Degradation, and the Batek of Pahang, Malaysia. Her interest in memory stem from the conviction that alternative or vernacular ways of knowing are often discounted and denied. So she's also an avid photographer, and for those interested, can look for her at her Instagram account, TP Lai, which I think we've also posted on our Facebook. So with that, I'd like to invite Takpo to present her work, and we'll follow it up with some comments from me and then open discussion for everyone else. Please go ahead, your floor is yours, Takpo.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Today I'm not going to talk about Cambodia, unfortunately, for those who have come just for that, so you can, because of time limits, so I'm not going to talk about them at all. I'm just going to focus on hunter-gatherers. And I think I better just share screen. So let's see.
Sorry, Takpo, you have to unmute yourself. I accidentally muted you.
Okay. All right. Okay, so in this presentation, I examine landscapes as routes to remembrance. My emphasis is on remembering, an active, ongoing process. I want to discuss how vernacular memories are often excluded from memory discourses. By vernacular, I mean the diverse and changing forms of memory that are derived from first-hand experience in small-scale communities, i.e. from ordinary people. The people I'm concerned with may have little or no emotional investment in national memories. Their memories are often unregarded and discarded by broader society. Among many problems, we contend with the politics of silencing. Modes of memory making in the context of a nation state are often arbitrary, in which memories are filtered through printed words, personality cults, commemorative practices, and the like. Along the way, some memories just slip away, ignored, considered unimportant, or silenced. By silence, I mean an active and transitive process. One silences a fact or an individual as a silencer silences a gun. One engages in the practice of silencing. Mentions and silences are thus active dialectical counterparts of which history is the synthesis. So silencing can be both deliberate or not. And that's basically all I'll mention of Trello here. The tendency in official memories is to privilege one interpretation of the past. And anytime one memory is ascendant, others will be silenced. When dealing with pre-literate societies, maybe the people are not even that interested in posterity. Still, that doesn't mean a lack of historical consciousness. It's just understood and expressed differently. This paper examines these differences by turning to landscapes. By focusing on landscapes, I'm not suggesting that other sites of memory are not significant. For example, the Kodi of Sumba, Indonesia, communicate memory via domestic objects. I examine intersections between remembering and forgetting. So focusing on the Batek and the Penan, with whom I've done fieldwork. These are groups of different degrees of incorporation into the state. All are open in the sense of having multi-stranded linkages to broader society. In the context of landscapes, questions arise. How are memories made and how are they silenced? Okay, landscape in my definition refers to the place of a culture. It is a world shaped by the activity of people. While I recognize the merit of Jonathan Padoe's critique that much writing on landscape and memory to date leaves the landscape inert, a blank canvas upon which humans inscribe meaning, here landscape remains the medium through which multiple histories are simultaneously remembered and forgotten, in the words of Tim Winter. For hunter-gatherers, memory is in the landscape. Professor Byron Griffin is sitting there in this audience, and this is his picture. And I like it because of the footprints in the picture, which are really great. Memories are cultivated, not something that reside only in one person's mind. Regular contact with places evokes remembrances. The landscape contains the memories. Retrieval is the process of acting on the landscape which animates those memories. The broader point is that vernacular memories are not just there for outsiders to extract. One needs to have local knowledge in the first place. I'm going to focus on sensations of places and how these sensations might be activated through the marks that are left. I'll begin with the way that Batek and Penan talk about making tracks. As I've examined in detail elsewhere in the article Lynn referred to just now, tracking involves careful attention to minute traces in the land, as well as sensory signals. But this is not how the Penan and Batek talk about it. For example, a Penan man, after returning from a long trip to an area he had not previously visited, explained that to Brosius, the anthropologist, that in order to find his way home, he simply followed his feelings. But though Penan and Batek make tracking sound easy, a matter of following the heart or the feelings, the kind of concrete knowledge it requires is clearly difficult to accomplish. It requires alertness on the trail, attentiveness to visual markers, sounds, and scents, and relating these ever-changing findings to personal and cultural memory in order to interpret the landscape and derive hypotheses about location, distance, and direction, and so on. My argument here is that memory in the case of hunter-gatherers is intimately related to how they leave traces in the land and how these traces shape the way of movement. We should also note how fast landscape details can change. If one habitually returns to a place, minute changes are recorded and one adjusts movement and thought accordingly. But when one pathways change and one does not return for years to a spot, the trail is unrecognizable. Much knowledge will consequently become rusty without continuous attempts to access and retrieve the finer details. Thus, there is a natural process of remembering and forgetting that goes on all the time and is particularly vulnerable to changes in practice. It is precisely these kinds of vernacular memories that are hard for outsiders to learn and easy to overlook. Um, so these sensations might be activated through the marks that are left. These are a rich source of everyday memories. Um, they could be physical traces, odors, sounds, and other impressions of the landscape. Footprints, smells, and sounds linger, thus continuing to indicate presence until the marks fade. Uh, for Eastern Penan, in the words of Jael Langu, as they move across the landscape, they establish a series of campsites which they leave behind as old campsites representing their footprints. These old campsites associated with events such as deaths, births, even humorous occurrences, become significant footprints of both the group and individuals linked to those places. These markers of past habitation allow Penan to trace the history in the landscape and thus are a source of cultural memory. So both Batek and Penan are much affected by these traces, particularly in the case of death. Both groups place the emphasis on visual markers. Batek say they cannot see the place where a loved one died. Western Penan, this is a Western Penan woman, she's dead now. Western Penan say that seeing the uban of someone who has died causes them great pain. For both Penan and Batek, the response is moving away to avoid seeing traces of the loved one. For Batek, death is often followed by a swift exit from the place of death, and then returning after sometimes years, sometimes never. So Penan and Batek also talk about the feelings. Tawai for Batek, Haib for Tawai for Penan, and Haib for Batek. These can be roughly glossed as feelings associated with nostalgia. I've described Haib as that inexpressible feeling of longing for something or someone that is absent. For Penan, in the words of Jao Langruk, Tawai is an expression of nostalgia, fondness, and longing for the landscape. It binds the group and individuals to the landscape. Batik talk often of Haib, not just for the dead, but for land, people who moved away, favorite foods, perhaps even for a way of life, such as the happy days we shared, traveling from fruit grove to fruit grove. So Haib can be painful, but Tawai, based on 2015 discussions with Eastern Penan, seems to be a wholly positive feeling that they treasure and fear to lose. It seems clear that landscape memory and sentiments are closely related. Um, Collectively, these sensations mark the history of the place, rendering it more than just a campsite or a settlement. Rather, I suggest they establish presence and belonging, thus rendering the place knowable and therefore returnable. Uh, Hunter-gatherer memory practices are intimately related to movement and landscape subtleties. Going to or passing through a place calls up the law. People tell the stories to one another, remember the friends featuring in their stories and the things that happened there. And the place itself may be well loved for its own aesthetic qualities, pulling people back time and time again, thus setting the scene for more story making. Uh, but as landscape deteriorates, such as has happened in all the hunter-gatherer territories I visited, the places may be left behind for good. What used to be everyday knowledge continually updated becomes memories, bereft of the practical and physical base that gives it continued meaning. The biographical associations, memories, narratives, and conceptual maps are detached from the landscape, becoming history without a place. And then there's some more stuff here on how Penan idioms have changed since they have become continuously, in some cases, adopted by NGOs and so on, but it doesn't matter. If landscape is made through practice and practice is subject to social cultural process, then memories, their meanings and values are subject to revision and reconstitution. As communities are incorporated into the nation state and practices change, we should expect to see more forgetting, more silencing. For local peoples, the ways of remembering are only likely to bring attention when outsiders, for example, deem them to be destructive. Uh, Up till now, activities with a high mnemonic content, such as the Penan's Molong, which involves marking plants that have not been claimed, thus reserving them for future harvest and use, or the Batek's replanting of yams, are largely documented by anthropologists only. Let me be clear, I'm not claiming that indigenous communities passively let go of cultural memories. Uh, With the onset of threat preceded by increasing degradation, as lands and resources are exploited by external interests, landscape and memories of the past come to seem ever more precious. The remains of landscape become, quote, tangible reminders of that which no longer exists except qua memory. And that's from Pierre Nora, French memory theorist. Uh, the fragments of memory can be traced everywhere we look, but this is not necessarily history as viewed by the guardians of national memories. The people I've examined in this paper, uh, to quote Pianora again, possessed reserves of memory, but little or no historical capital. They are ignored, silenced, or excluded from memory making. And sometimes it can be threatening to remember. In Cambodia, for example, I found that people opted not to talk about the trauma of the Khmer Rouge period. And also Kiyong, studying former Hakka displaced people in Sarawak, found also that they didn't want to talk. They didn't want to remember. They didn't want to be prodded on those memories that only place them in a situation where they are at the bottom end of society. I open this paper by suggesting that the people in it may not be invested in national memories. This statement should be qualified. I would say that there is a dialectical relationship between local and national. For example, the pain of losing landscape to loggers, plantation owners, and dam builders made it easier for me to record and retrieve the Penan's memories. Relations between national and local historical consciousness can enable memory, but they can also constrain them. I'm thinking about education and a drive towards literacy. In Malaysia, two insidious ways that people are shaped are via a national school curricula and a standardized national language. According to Francis Lowe, the Federal Ministry of Education is in charge of so much, including developing the school curricula, recruiting and training and posting teachers, promoting head teachers all over the country. System has become too politicized and centralized, with control over some 420,000 teachers and 32,000 odd officers. And aside from what state systems promote in terms of education and ideology, they also shape bodily practices. Like gestures and postures, how to sit and stand, talk to elders, ask and answer questions, present oneself as clean and neat, and the like, and over-determine what counts as knowledge. State-sponsored knowledge in Malaysia tends to be homogenized, imposed, and is often experienced as such. It is through investigating how landscape and memory are interrelated that we can learn a different way of remembering. Memories inherent in landscapes are often in tension. When the memories are complementary, for example, you have different groups, for example, who share the same historical territory, the tension can be very fruitful and productive. When they are not, for example, when people are moved away, the memories, as I wrote earlier, are detached from the landscape and becoming politics. So I hope that that's clear. I've actually jumped from bit to bit in this paper. And basically, I'm just saying that hunter-gatherers, they are not historical actors. They don't have the power to wield them to establish the memories in the national consciousness, and actually are not so sure that they should. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Takpo, for that presentation. Definitely a lot to think through this very important work. Feel free to write your questions, so also maybe put your hand up if you're interested in asking questions. I'm gonna maybe start with a couple of comments just to get the ball rolling, and then we'll have a larger discussion. So Takpo, I'm actually I find your work actually very powerful, though you kind of maybe understate it. I find the political sort of connotation of linking memories or vernacular, you use the term vernacular memories or vernacular histories to landscapes, actually very powerful. And it really, in terms, in particular, your focus on this act of remembering as this very active act of memory making and history making in that sense. And it made me think about memory science, which talks about how memory, is partly, it starts with you encoding the particular event or the particular what situation, and then you the second part is recalling, which is remembering. And it is people who study the science talk about how it's very context binding, and it's related to what you're saying, how it is really it's not just what happened, but all these other sentiments that also is part of what happened, right? The kind of memories of the senses, the smells, the textures, the feeling, like following the feeling to get home. So these are kinds of contextual binding to our memory that's very important. So I think that's really interesting and very important, because it says something about when you think about culture and how what indigenous communities understand, and the kind of production. I mean, I think one of your agenda in this paper is showing how these local or knowledge production, it's not considered important, right? This so the politics of knowledge production. And so you might not think these kinds of knowledge production as being important because they don't fit into this particular framework of sort of these national narratives or national history, but these are very rich and very diverse. So it's not just sort of what happened, but all these other things, all these other sentiments that come with it. It reminds me of the work of Keith Basso, who I think you reference in your paper. He wrote a book called Wisdom Sits in Places, and it's a very beautiful book that sort of looks at thinking through place names and landscapes as a way to understand the Apache's history and culture and moral codes and moral values. So within the landscape, the culture and values are embedded. And so I think this is what also you're showing through your work, how these landscapes embed so much more than what happened here, or how do we get there, but these other kinds of values, that's really the culture of the community. So which leads me to then come to the question, what happens then when these landscapes are no longer there, when these landscapes where wisdom sits, where culture is embedded, is no longer visible? The mountains is flattened, the river is no longer there, the trees have been cut down. Then what happens to the community, to the culture, to the wisdom when this is not around? So it also makes me think about, in terms of thinking of the political connotation about this, and how we get very upset and very angry when we see say national monuments or historical sites being desecrated, right? The idea of like an ancient figurine being disfigured, that really speaks to, people are angered by this idea because it's where the culture of the community or the history of the community is then destroyed. But somehow people don't feel the same sense of discomfort or even anger at the idea of landscapes, of forests being desecrated or mountains being flattened, because somehow they don't see culture as embedded within these landscapes. So I think that kind of connection that you are making actually has a very important political connotation in that sense. So that's sort of the first point I like to make. The second is on this idea of fragments. You didn't talk about the sort of the story in Cambodia, but the idea of that, there's all these like the vernacular histories are little bits and fragments that you can't quite capture it all. And I think you gave this anecdote from Peter Brosis, where he sort of finally resigned and said, there's no one single story, but there's all these other different fragments of stories that people tell you. And then you just have to be comfortable with the fact that there's no one single story, but multiple stories and bits of different stories. And so this is sort of how the collective history works, and different people might have different stories. So it actually, one, because I'm also in the project of this documentation process, as I'm involved with some communities as they're doing litigation or so anticipation of a time where they would have to go to court. So they're going, communities are doing active documentation. And you talked about this idea of like when people like us and also others who document, and what happens when you try to document something that's multidimensional and try to linearize it, and what gets lost, and what is the implication of this kinds of process. So I'd like to maybe think through with you and others here, how might we be able to engage in this process, which is important. Documentation is important for certain purposes, but how can we do that while honoring the multidimensionality of these histories, or the fragmented ways this history are told? So that's sort of my second point. And my third point, it's sort of related again to this idea that there's these like Marisol de la Cadena uses the term partial connections, where we're kind of like different worldviews. So we're kind of understanding each other a little bit, but sometimes there's also like a creative, I think she used the term creative misunderstanding of certain ideas and concepts, because we kind of understand it, but not really. So I think you talk a little bit about your own experiences in sort of trying to understand a particular landscape, but you can understand it at a certain surface, like the water body, but not really knowing where is the boundary of this water body, for example. So there's these partial connections that happens between people who, the local community, and people like us who are trying to understand what's happening. And in anthropology, I think one of the sort of the first few classes that we take is often, students are taught about, thinking about amic and attic, binary, and it's set up as a binary in terms of thinking about amic and how people understand, events, or how they understand their worldview and how they relate it to us researchers. And amic and ethic is how we sort of try to make sense. It might be trying to make sense of it within a larger political economy, or perhaps within our own worldview. So given that, and I think it's still something that we teach our students in thinking of with these kind of binaries, right? How people that we study think and how we might interpret what they're saying. Is this still a productive way of approaching ethnography? How then should we maybe think about it in a different way, as we're also, thinking through the framework that our interlocutors are also sharing with us, right? Taking things like the idea of like earth beings, or the ideas of spirits, or the ideas of feelings, just as seriously as we would, any other form of information, without having to interpret it within our worldview and thinking feelings might mean X, Y, and Z within the more logical kind of sense, right? How do we then sort of think through these different worldviews and be able to understand it within, in a way that we also honor the different frameworks as well? So I think those are my sort of three starting questions, and I let you, you can respond to them, or we can also open it up to the larger audience. But thank you so much for such a fruitful piece of work that triggers a lot of different things for me, and I'm sure for others here as well.
Yeah, thank you. Partial connections. Is it a productive way? First of all, let's deal with that. Etic and enic. Oh, by the way, I just this morning was hurriedly typing my lecture to my students at 3 o'clock on Keith Vessel. So interesting how things kind of come up to the fore here. No, I think for depends on what you want to your students to know. I mean, because I want my students to know that they have particular ideas of the world, which may or may not be shared by the people in the field. And so you have to start somewhere and say, okay, here's etic and here's emic. And then after that, just let them collapse the boundaries on their own. I mean, to me, that's the most effective way. Um, when I say collapse the boundaries on their own, I mean when I take them to the field and then they see. In fact, my students have been shocked at themselves when they come out of the field with me, when they realize how much they had to learn from the orang asli and how much the emic perspective made sense to the extent that they couldn't recognize what the etic perspective was anymore. On okay, then I forget the other questions.
How do we document, like how do the process of documentation sort of flattens these multidimensional histories? Like what would be a methodology that what kind of methodologies do you think we should sort of think about in doing this? I mean, you yourself talk about how the process of documentation, I think you use it to linearize the histories. Like, so how can we sort of think through this a bit more?
Um, it depends on the audience. I mean, I think if you're presenting it for a court case, there's lots of things you don't put inside in the documentation. And yeah, so depends on the urgency of the situation, really. I know it's frustrating because there's so much. I mean, it's like, for example, when I was helping the Penan to document their residents for claims, I was doing genealogies going back 300 years. But in the end, none of it mattered because all it is was to say that they were there, and there was so much information to say that they were there that all the background history didn't matter. So that's my view of it. Aside from that, all the other things that I wrote about in this paper, I think that's the writing of someone who's been at it a long time. 20, 30 years with one group and then 10 and so on with the other. So it's only when you have time to sit back, then only you can let yourself go, I think. So I think depends on the audience. I mean, if it's for a court case or for anything, a claims or whatever, you just do whatever you have to do. And I think part of it is to not cry while you're doing it. No, to not cry, to keep yourself tight-lipped and just focus on the stuff that needs to be done. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. for the moment anyway.
Okay, well, I don't want to hog the space, but let me see if there's anyone else who'd like to ask Takpo questions or respond to any of the discussions earlier.
Yes.
Professor Kirk Endicott, please feel free to unmute yourself. I think Zikri might have to help do that.
Hi, can you hear me now? Yeah, I'm interested in the, when we had the hunter-gatherers who are so individualistic and egalitarian that each person has individual memories. I'm wondering if there is any process by which these are shared and gradually become what we might think of as a folk history that's shared among the people, so that you get something that's more a part of the culture instead of just the individual memory. And there aren't any storytelling authorities necessarily, people who tell stories around the campfire at night, and this is the way it is, and children learn it from them. There's some sort of process by which the individual experiences become shared. Can you speak a little about that?
Shared stories. I don't think there's any point at which individual stories become shared stories. In the sense that I think sometimes it does happen. For example, a river, let's say, a river becomes named for something that happened there. And then you hear the story, it's like, so he got that monkey on that river. That's all. Yeah. Then that little story becomes part of the law for a while, but not for a long time. I mean, it doesn't last very long. So I really don't know. I mean, I don't know, honestly speaking. But I think that there are occasions where personal stories become are used to label landscapes, a river here, campsite there, and so on. But then after a while, of course, after several cycles of people going through that landscape, the story changes.
Is there anything like what we think of as history where I found myself sometimes trying to figure out where people lived, when, and what was happening to them, and so on, which is a very Western sort of way to think about things. And one of the, so if we record the stories, we pull them all together and we say, okay, this is the history of a certain group of people. But that it doesn't seem to be their way of thinking about things. They're more in the present, except for their own personal memories, which they heap from in encounters with places and people again and so on. But they don't get pulled together into a permanent picture of what happened in the past. Is that your thinking on this?
Yeah, I think so too. I agree. I think people, but I think, I think sometimes I just don't know, because I get the sense that people do want to know these things. but they don't necessarily want to know dates, of course.
No.
But they want to know in the past, what was it like? Who were there? How did they do things? How is it different from the way we do things today? That's something that they do want to know. So something between the Western kind of knowledge, and then something between something like they don't care. So there's something, yeah.
If I could just ask one more question. How do you think of folk tales? There are folk tales, some of which get fairly standardized and repeated, and others that are specific to, why does a certain animal have certain characteristics or something like that. How do you conceptualize folk tales in the context of a memory and history?
Well, I know that was my first research project all the way back when I was a student,
Mhm.
30 years ago. They don't recognize, I don't think, I'm trying to think whether you ask people to tell a story about the past and then it goes straight into a folk tale. No, it doesn't go like that.
No.
So folk tales are told as a kind of adjunct activity. I think Alice said that there is some more morality lesson being taught in these tales, which I also did in my MA thesis. But I don't think that they are considered to be part of the history.
Okay. Well, thank you. This gives me a lot to think about. I
Yeah.
don't need to take up more of everybody's time. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question from Aisha Kashani, and she asked if I could read it. Thanks so much for such a generous presentation. I'm wondering about museums as state and federal institutions. Obviously, they are incredibly problematic colonial spaces that play a major part in creating or maintaining state narratives. But is there a way you can imagine, in an ideal world, museums being harnessed in a positive way on behalf of communities like the Batek and the Penan?
Yeah, I mean, but I think the presentation of the materials would have to be thought, rethought. For example, for example, audio, a lot of audio in such a museum. You could have a lot of video in the background playing rather than just a static uh, uh, statue or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could imagine it, but I think, would it be possible? No. Yeah.
Mm. Actually, I mean, it's quite it's related to sort of what I was trying to get at by are there different ways of documenting these fragments, and I think the example that you gave was one of it. It was not just sort of documenting it in text, but it could be in these audio forms and on photography, and I think you've done some of this. So in this way, you can capture more of that, fragments or multidimensionality of these
Yeah.
histories, right?
Okay, I
Yeah.
get it now. Well,
Right.
we have the what do you call it? Roy, RWAAI, Austroasiatic something something. What is the full name of it? It's where I'm also a member of it,
Mm-hmm.
where we all have deposited our recordings of stuff there. And I hope along the way, somehow or other, we will find a way to make them available to the Batik. In fact, they are available to the Batik or to whoever you're studying right now, uh, but upon request right now.
Mhm. Okay. There's a second part to Aisha's question just now. On also your thoughts on art approaches like Gurimis Art Project as an alternative way of highlighting Orang Asli or Orang Asal memories and histories. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Gurimis Art Project.
No, I'm not.
I mean, I don't know the full context either, but they've recently launched an art space which highlights the work of Orang Asli and Orang Asal artisans and artists, and sort of they're highlighting stories in a different format. Even I think this weekend they had like a cooking demonstration. They had artists weaving and showing their weaving. There was also a dance performance. Several different artists like Lenny and also Shaka has been involved also in the Grimace Art Project.
I see. I got the page open here. But this is Indonesian, yeah?
No, it's Malaysian based. I don't know if anyone else here are more familiar. Maybe someone here might be from Gurimis who would like to say a bit about the work. Basically, it's an art collective, but maybe there are other. Please do write in and tell us a bit more about this project. I also been meant to go and take a look, but I didn't get a chance to do so. There's a question by Lao Zi Xiao. Thank you, Dr. Lai, for the sharing. I have a few questions to learn from you. Zisha, would you like to ask yourself, or would you like for me to read this question? Maybe you would like to just turn on your mic and ask.
And video or something.
Just wait a second. Maybe Zisha, Sikri, can you check if you're able to give mic authorization?
Is there any mechanism of memory preservation, a structured system?
Okay, so maybe I'll just read. I'm curious on, is there any mechanism of memory preservation from the Batek and Penan people, especially a structured system of communication, in quotes, such as languages, which I assume a key mechanism for memory to be preserved in its records or documentation to deliver through generations?
I don't know. I mean, what does it mean?
Some sort of like oral history tradition, perhaps?
Of course they do. Yeah, I mean, there's no, I don't know any community that doesn't have such a tradition. So what is?
I'm not sure if I'm interpreting this correctly, but please feel free to clarify. Second, just for sharing, I read a book named Recalling Forgotten Tastes of Illustrated Edible Plants, Food and Memories by Sharifah Nadira, a really beautiful book. It's an example of preserving indigenous knowledge on plants and food. I don't know if there's a particular comment to that, but maybe just to share that project.
Okay, all right, I'll look at that.
Okay, Zikri, can you let Zi Xiao unmute herself? Boleh tak? She says, I need your help.
Actually, Zishal can actually unmute himself.
Okay, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, yeah.
Can you do that?
Yeah, I already asked him
Okay.
to unmute. Yeah.
Okay, Zi Xiao, please unmute. We'd love to hear more from you.
Abraham Mu, thank you for explaining Ruai, RWAAI. Abraham Mu.
So maybe, well, we're trying to, I do want to get back to this idea of documentation and sort of documenting in different ways. I know a lot of indigenous communities, at least the Orang Asli, are quite actively documenting either through community mapping and also documenting the histories, folklores, all these stories. What do you think of this sort of process of documentation? Now, you mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned in this presentation, but at least in your paper, you mentioned the idea of how maps, you find that maps kind of flatten the landscape or the story of the landscape in sort of the map that you were given a map of the area in Cambodia where you worked in. Can you maybe say a bit more about that, the role of maps?
I mean, maps are very important. What else do you want to say? Yeah, I mean, they're necessary. I'm not arguing with that at all, and that they are necessary, that they be put in a certain format to be understandable in the legal cases. But then I think also you can have, aside from that, for the community, maps that are more like traditional thinking, space and time, um, and and how space and time are joined together.
Yeah, do you have examples of this kind of sort of different types of unconventional maps that you talked about, that you just mentioned?
Not right now, no. The ones that I remember looking at were from Canada, and they were pretty, I mean, they're pretty great in the sense that each map has the English name, but that's not the main purpose. The main purpose is the indigenous name and then the meaning of it in English. And it's quite beautiful, I think. But the texture of the map is also typical flat. So it's a map to find your way in the landscape, but it's not a map that actually um, gets into people's minds of how they see the landscape.
Right.
I haven't read Keith Vessel's book yet. I've read his article, but not the book yet. So I'll be interested to see whether, does he?
It doesn't talk about mapping, more sort of, it was a journey as he traveled through this landscape with these individuals and who would then relate to him the stories of the landscape. There was during the recent RAI presentation, there was an interesting project where a graduate student who worked on a GIS map of endangered birds. He then collaborated with a Tanka artist, because when he was working with it is in Bhutan, and when he was working with the indigenous peoples in Bhutan, the stories of the birds had there were a lot of stories from sort of the traditional stories about the areas and where the birds were located, and so he wanted to be able to then include those stories and what these spaces meant. It's like these spaces were sacred spaces meant to the community. So he worked with a Tanka, I think Tanka, right? That draws these like maybe I think it's they call it Tanka artist, which when they draw the traditional method of drawing in Bhutan, and so they overlaid this GIS map with this traditional painting, and it was a beautiful map of deities and sacred spaces. But on a GIS, layered on a GIS map. So I think that was quite interesting.
Yeah,
yeah.
I think Sheila, Atika, all these other young people, Jackie, Ashton, I think it's your job. You find us the solutions here.
I think Colin, who's also here, has been involved in a project with using Google Earth and sort of layering stories and audios and voices from the community. I don't know if Colin, if you'd like to share any of that.
Yes, we did a project with Google Earth, Voyager. We can give you the link later. But I think one of the better maps I've come across is the one, those done by the Penans in Upper Baram. Baram area with Bruno Mensa funds, and very, very detailed maps done over a decade of work, all done by the communities. And they have very detailed information about not just places and histories, but, I mean, it's a very good map. If you got to get a chance of it, look at it, But can I switch the topic a bit, because I want to refer to what Kirk Endicott mentioned just now about oral history and acceptance by people. See, you might be interested to know that when such kinds of histories, oral traditions are used in court, it's often argued to be hearsay, because my grandfather told my father, and so on. No, so in law that is completely not acceptable. But in a very important decision in Canada, the Delgamuukw case, Delgamuukw versus British Columbia, 1997 case, the courts ruled that oral history can be accepted as evidence in court, provided that what do you call it? They must demonstrate that the narrative is both necessary and reliable. So who is telling the story is very important, not just anybody in the village. It must be the storyteller, the shaman, the head, the cultural leader, and so on. So, and that has been accepted as evidence. So oral history, even though hearsay in normal legal standards, is considered as evidence. So we were using that argument in the Sagong Tasi case without realizing that even in our own Evidence Act, there's already a provision for oral history to be regarded as evidence. And this is in the case of the land law in Negeri Sembilan, especially the Adat law, where transfers of lands were always done by oral traditions. So oral history and stories and all these kind of things you're talking about does have a role to play in law, in staking a claim for land rights, provided it is relevant, necessary, and reliable. Thank you.
That's interesting to know. Thank you, Colin. Okay, I will go and document all the oral history.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colin. And feel free to drop the link to the project that you were involved in. And also, I don't know if there's also a link to the Penan project as well, which I've also caught a very short glimpse of it. But I think they presented at Penang, right? They came in to present at the Penang conference as well. Let me see if there's any other questions. Feel free to indicate if you have a question, or yeah, Vishalini, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Lai. Thank you very much for your very, very illuminating presentation. Okay, I have a question about how traditional ecological knowledge is passed on in the Batek community. So from what I gathered in your presentation, you said that oral histories are more individual, but when it comes to sustained livelihoods and food security of the community, so how is the knowledge of how, for example, food is procured in the natural environment, how is that passed on to the next generation? Is it done within families, or is it a community knowledge? How does that work out? Do you have any knowledge of that?
Yeah, it's not passed on in the sense, sorry. This was part of my lecture in my class this afternoon. It's not passed on, it's it arises from a community context. So, for example, let's say you are a man and you are a hunter, a great hunter, and other people will come to you to learn the skills. But if you are a bad hunter, no one will come to you. Even your own son will go to someone else. So skills tend to follow skills tend to follow whoever has the skills, obviously. So it's not passed on from father to son or from mother to daughter in that way. In some families, you find that, for example, my friend, she's a great weaver and she weaves exactly the same time every year. So, and her daughters all are learning from her. And I think the grandchildren are also learning from them. And so, because two anthropologists are working with this community of people, it seems like everybody is working on weaving, for example. But it's not, because in other places you can see people are not learning it. So traditional, so-called tradition, it doesn't get passed on. It's there. The skills, the knowledge, whatever it is there, and then whoever wants to learn it can learn it. But even back in the 90s when I first arrived, it was very much whoever, I was trying to see, let's say, hunters who went with who, and there was no it was uncertain. It was sometimes it was like one uncle there and then one great uncle here, one great nephew here. So it doesn't flow linearly. Did I answer your question?
Yes, Dr. Lai, if I may just add a little bit to that, a sort of a sub question. So in terms of medicinal knowledge, like if they have medicine woman or man, a shaman, and how is that knowledge, kept within the community and you ensure its continued existence, because that is very important knowledge. Is there a system or like a structure, or is it the same?
Yeah, it's the same like what I just said. The thing to do, the thing to remember is that there is no system, and it survives because there's no system. Because there is a need for that knowledge, so it continues to exist. So, but Batik are kind of, I don't know about the Penan so much, but Batik are kind of in and out people. So they will, on the one hand, accept regular medical assistance from the government, from the Ministry of Health. And on the other hand, they will still practice traditional medicine when they have, well, doctors are not there all the time. So when they're not there, they need to, things like, for example, if you have a cut in your hand and you need leaves to put on it, then, that knowledge seems to exist.
Does that answer your question, Risha? Okay.
Yes, it does, Dr. Lai. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. So that's the link by, thank you, Abraham, for sharing the link to the documentation from that was funded by Bruno Manser Foundation that Colin mentioned earlier. And also Colin has also shared the links to the Google Earth Voyager project that you can view, but I think you need to download the Google Earth app first. But it's quite amazing work that you should definitely try and take a look at it. Any other questions here? We can take a couple more before we wrap up for the day. Okay, let's see. I wanted to just follow up a little bit about, you've done these audio, visual kind of, you've done presentations and then what's the response of the community, the Batik themselves, when they see you trying to capture and document their stories in these different ways and presenting it back to them? Do they recognize these stories, or they're like, what is this?
No, they love it. They
Yeah.
love it. And they themselves also now carry handphones.
Mhm.
So I don't, I kind of like, you know, put the line there and say, okay, these are the things I don't want to look at, because if I do, I will end up looking at them forever and never end. You know, like videos and photographs that they have taken in the last few years or so. I think since 2005. So that's a lot already. That's about 5 years. No, 2000 and 2005, 6. Sorry, today I haven't had enough sleep. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, 15 years of stuff for people to look at. Yeah, they whenever we have gone out um, and then I've showed them the videos. They've liked it. If they haven't liked it, I will know, and then I'll just suppress it.
Okay, that's also interesting that they're also actively documenting using phones and doing photography. I think this is one of the things that also some of the Orang Asli youth are getting to do filmmaking and creating YouTube videos, sort of using YouTube, TikTok, and things like that, sort of presenting their stories in these different multimedia formats.
Yeah, but I don't think Batik are that keen on it. It just happens that sometimes they'll be taking a picture or video or something.
Mhm.
I don't think they are that interested in it compared to some other Orang Asli.
Mhm. Right. Okay. Let's see. There's a question. Okay. Sorry, that was sort of directed to me. Yeah. No other question. Is there any other questions for anyone else? Vishalini, go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Lai, I didn't want to hog the session, which is why I kept this question for a little later. The Batiks are normally nomadic, right, Dr. Lai? They're
It used to be, but most of them are
semi-nomadic now?
semi-sedentary.
Semi-sedentary, right. So what, in your observation, what has been the impact on their lives from having moved from a nomadic lifestyle to a semi-sedentary, from a psychological point, or in terms of health, sustaining food supply, food security, because they can't, I mean, I don't know how they would do their hunting and gathering. So is it a very drastic change to their lifestyle in that sense?
I think what it is that they are. I think this one I don't know the long-term effect, but one thing is that they are more likely to find their mates, boyfriend, girlfriend, from people who are close by. So it could be a cousin, could be a second cousin or third cousin, but people who are nearby. So in the old days, of course, when you're moving about, then occasionally the boys would go off and the girls would go off, and they would somehow meet. But nowadays, I think there's less of that happening. I'm not sure. I mean, this is just a hypothesis. So yeah, I see a lot of first cousin marriages. Aside from that, what you said about it being a drastic change, I don't think so. Because the way the Batik do it is people kind of ease into a way of life. And this is, I'm not saying that it's the way that the Batik in Kelantan or the Batik in Terengganu do it, but certainly the Batik in Pahang had plenty of time. And so when they don't want to be stuck to one settlement, they'll go traveling around. Um, and so for some groups, they're still mobile in the forest in Taman Negara, but others are increasingly more and more spending time in the settlements. This past year with COVID, I think they just went into the forest.
Yes, Dr. Lai, I've read about that too, how they had to really go back to the forest to ensure that, you know, they have some kind of food security during the pandemic. Also, from what I understand, because of the change in land use, their foraging area has become a lot more smaller. And it is also part of the government policy to settle nomadic tribes. So it is, I'm not sure. It seems as though it's something that's been forced on them rather than something that they would have chosen of their own free will. So is there any way to know this from your moving with the community? Whether it's, yeah.
So what? I'm sorry. What is it?
No, is there any way to know whether it is a personal choice for them to be settled or whether they were forced to do it because of circumstances that were imposed on them?
No, there's no forcing. There's no forcing.
Okay.
Because some of them, they started these for a long time now. The Batik have, like going back to the 1940s or so, 1950s. Batik have always just put down roots when, whenever they felt the need to. So so they've just continued the pattern now.
Okay.
So asking them, it's hard to it's hard to imagine any project that would succeed that was all about forcing. But they would just just go and do their own thing.
Mhm. Thanks, Vishalini, for your questions. We have a question from Abraham Mu. Has your personal remembering as an urban citizen changed upon learning about remembrance of the Batek or Penan? If so, how?
Yeah, it has changed, but I'm sorry, I just got my booster dose of vaccine this morning, so I'm a little bit woozy. Yeah, I mean, it has changed obviously because of realizing what memory is and coming to know about it. But unfortunately, I can't really give details because the problem is that I have a very good memory. I had a good memory until a few years ago. So it's very hard for me to think about how it has changed. Sorry, Abraham.
It's a very good question, actually. Yeah, and I think you've sort of answered it partially, and sort of thinking about, yeah, it definitely has changed the way you think about it, because you're more aware of all these different things that triggers memory, right, and remembering. Thank you so much, Takpo, for your presentation, and thank you so much for all the participants for staying on, and for all your questions. Feel free to be in touch with us. So the recording will be up later this week. And thank you so much again, Takpo, for really stimulating conversation. I'm glad to see, I think there's a lot of future anthropologists and ethnographers as well with us here today. And we look forward to the kind of work that you'll be doing in the future. I think, I don't know, Zikri, you'd like to say something about the upcoming program. So today's the last of our series for webinar for this year. We thank all of you for following us. We're taking a bit of a break next month, but we have other events coming up for next month. Go ahead, Zikri.
Oh, wait, before I go, I can stay here for a while. If anyone wants to chat to me, I see a few old friends in the audience.
Okay, we'll have a teh tarik session after this, virtual teh tarik session. Go ahead, Zikri.
Hi everyone. Good night. Yeah, I just mentioned by Dr. Sasina earlier that this will be our last session for the year. But then again, for next month, we are going to focus on launching the Said Zahari Young Journalist Award, of which Pusat Sejarah Rakyat has been organizing for the third consecutive year from 2019, 2020, and this would be our third year. So we are open to receive any participants for the announcement so that we can encourage more young journalists to be, how to say, like documenting all the progressive and of course important news in our country. So we are going to launch the program tomorrow. So it's going to be a month-long announcement, award announcement actually, and then we're going to announce it by next year. So stay tuned, and for those who actually have a network with our journalist friends, it would be great for all of you to share the announcement to them as well. Yeah, I guess that's about it. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Dr. Takpo, and everyone for the session today. All right.
Thank you so much, Zikri and Fahmi, for being part of the technical team, also Po Hyung Hong. So I think we can turn off the Facebook Live, and then but we'll leave this channel open if people like to talk to Takpo and say hi. Okay, thank you, everyone. So feel free